I always was someone who isolated and avoided other people for many reasons. When I was a kid, I deeply sensed that my needs are somehow different and unwanted. So I cried a lot, got angry at the world and most people, because this overstimulating world and the people with narcissistic tendencies around me were so exhausting that I sometimes spent just days isolating in my room. I often got so upset with the world that I remember clearly I told myself in my head the sentence, "one man army always wins." And I just knew that I would be better off alone in this world and that most other people won't help but rather harm me. So my life took place more inside and it felt relieving. Spending time alone gave and to this day still gives me a sense of peace, calmness and relaxation. Isolation is recovery for my body and soul. And at the same time, I always had the longing for closeness and connection. I didn't want to feel lonely. I needed alone time and company, but in a balanced way. Luckily, I always had a strong sense for who would hurt me and who I could trust and rely on. I knew that if I wanted to find and build healthy and safe relationships, I had to open up, at least to some people. And fast forward to today, I've had some really rough relationships in my life, which were kind of re-traumatizing, yes, but in the end, I am very grateful that I found a few very trustworthy, authentic and honest friends and a loving partner. And I believe I was always scanning for sensitive souls in this world. Sensitive souls who would understand my individual needs. And so are the people who I have close relationships with today. They are people like me who also sometimes need their alone time in isolation. With those people, I feel safe most of the time. Still, sometimes when I need to isolate and spend time alone, or they need their space and time alone, we don't want to justify ourselves anymore. If anyone tells us that it's wrong or unhealthy to spend time alone, please go yourself. We are tired of being pathologized and shamed for that. And if you can relate to my story now, and you also sometimes meet people who say that isolation is unhealthy and wrong, please send them this video here. They have to understand that for people like us, who are introverts, highly sensitive souls, traumatized, or neurodivergent, other people are the trigger. Other people are the source of the wound and the overstimulation and overwhelm we experience day on and day off. And isolation is a way to help us re-regulate. For better understanding, in today's video, I have put together 10 reasons why we isolate and need alone time. And I try to explain every single reason in a really compassionate and understandable way. So without further ado, let's dive into that. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert, and let's directly dive into reason number 1 here, why we isolate and avoid other people, which is we want safety, stability, and peace. These were the 3 words that I have read the most when researching this video. Safety, stability, peace. And it makes sense because if you have been through complex trauma like me, the world can truly feel chaotic and overwhelming for us. Isolation then often becomes our only way to find safety, to find stability and peace. Often it's also not that we don't want connection. I personally always had a strong sense for needness and connection as well, and I've read that many of you out there also often feel lonely when isolating. Still, it's that being alone feels like the only way to finally relax and to let our guard down, to reduce this high system of crazy alert which is constantly running within us. So trauma rewires our brains to stay on high alert, always scanning for dangers. This is what I mean. It's hypervigilance what we're talking about here. And in hypervigilance, even simple interactions can feel risky or exhausting then. Many people here on YouTube have shared that being alone gives them space to breathe without worrying about judgment or unpredictability. As one person put in here, when I'm alone, I can finally relax, and that is so true. Because being alone shields us from overwhelming stimuli from the outside, from criticism, from judgment and potential sources of dysregulation. It also gives us more control in a way, because it removes those unpredictable variables like emotionally immature other beings, right? And giving up that high level of control can feel pretty scary. I know that. Letting in people into your life, opening up, that's super risky because they could disrupt the stability you've worked so hard to create for years maybe. And if you struggle with emotional dysregulation, which is also caused by early childhood trauma, then even small interactions can leave you drained, replaying conversations in your head and making you feeling so overwhelmed. So if you isolate in order to feel safe, to feel stable and more peaceful, remember that this is not a weakness here. It's a survival mechanism. And trauma teaches us to prioritize safety, and sometimes isolation feels like the only way to achieve that. If that sounds familiar, know that you're not alone in this and that it's okay to prioritize that. That was the first reason. Let's talk about the second one, which is a narcissist destroyed us. Narcissistic abuse is another big element that many people make to isolate. If you have been in a relationship with a narcissist before, you know what I'm talking about here. People who have been married to someone with narcissistic tendencies or traits often want to isolate and avoid people and relationships basically for the rest of their lives. And I feel that because narcissistic abuse is so rough, and I don't wish that, truly not, to anyone. The manipulation and judgment of a narcissist leaves deep scars in us. They twist our reality, make us doubt ourselves, and convince us that we are unworthy or unlovable. They exploit us, suck out our energy and positivity. It's basically like soul raping, I would say. And even after they're gone, their wounds linger. They make it hard to trust anyone again. And this is even more toxic than the relationship before, I would say. And this is one huge problem of why so many of us want to avoid relationships in general after such an experience. Because afterwards, we isolate because it feels safer. Letting people in can feel like opening the door to more pain. And many of us think things like, I'd rather be alone than risk getting hurt like this again. Makes sense. If a narcissist destroyed our sense of self, being alone feels like the only way to rebuild it and heal from that. For some of us, especially if the narcissist was a parent, this also ties to attachment wounds. We might have learned to suppress our needs or become overly self-reliant, which also makes it even harder to connect with others from now on. And isolation isn't about rejecting people here. It's about protecting ourselves to make healing possible. Reason number 3, we are Auto-Regulators and Self-Soothers, which is basically avoidant attachment. So Auto-Regulators and Self-Soothers if we have learned to primarily or only rely on ourselves in order to keep ourselves regulated. This is a common thing with avoidant attachment styles because independence becomes a shield against pain on the outside then. If we grew up in an environment where our needs weren't allowed to be met, then we have learned that depending on others wasn't a safe option. So we try to handle our emotions just by ourselves. And for those people, co-regulation, so relying on someone else to regulate, like the mother figure or the father figure, that was not even an option here. One commenter on YouTube explained that perfectly. He said, "I don't even think to ask others for help. It's just easier to deal with things alone." And this is typical for what I just described. It's not about being cold here, it's about self-protection. Letting people in feels so risky, and this is why we distract ourselves with things such as hobbies, work, or routines in order to stay control. Typical things avoidantly attached people would do. And for people who isolate because of an avoidant attachment style, self-soothing isn't just a habit, it's a survival mechanism again. What I also want to make clear here is that it's still a mechanism that we have learned in order to function in a toxic family system that we used to live in, but now we are adults, we are fully grown up, and not everyone out there is like our caregivers at home. And that also means that for people who are avoidantly attached, avoidance isolation can be reduced and healing is possible here. For us, that means slowly letting others in again while still honoring our needs for safety and space here. Reason number 4, our attachment style is disorganized or chaotic. So isolation is not just an element for avoidantly attached people, but it's also for anyone who is having a disorganized attachment style. By the way, I also made a full episode about the 4 attachment styles, which I will link to you up here and in the description below. And for anyone with a disorganized attachment style, isolation comes from a deep fear of relationships feeling unpredictable or overwhelming. If our attachment style is disorganized or chaotic, it means that we have experienced both a strong longing for connection and a fear of it at the same time. And often we felt those 2 poles for the same person, whether it was our mom or our dad. The problem is here, when this caregiver person actually was narcissistic or even incapable of re-regulating themselves, they were sometimes a source of love and sometimes a threat to us. And this created a painful pull-push dynamic. We crave closeness, but we don't really trust it. This ambivalence is absolutely shattering for every child, of course. And I've read someone writing, "I want connection, but as soon as people get close, I freeze. I either push them away or cling too much, and it scares me." This describes pretty well the internal conflict that can make relationships feel impossible to navigate, leading us to avoid them entirely. Disorganized attachment is also closely tied to emotional dysregulation and trauma responses like dissociation here. Relationships can then trigger intense fear, shame, or even confusion about what we want. One moment, we might crave love and support, and the next, we're overwhelmed by the fear of getting hurt or abandoned. And that makes it so exhausting here. This chaotic inner world often drives us to isolate, not because we don't want connection, but because managing those emotions feels too overwhelming. And being alone feels like, again, the only way to regain control here and avoid the risk of getting hurt again. It's not about giving up on people, it's about trying to find safety in this super chaotic world where nothing and no one feels really safe. Reason number 5, we have missing boundaries. And that's another big reason here, the sense of missing boundaries. I always was a big isolator myself, but when I read about boundaries the first time in my life, it kind of clicked within my head. I read a comment during the time of my second therapy where a person wrote, "Boundaries always just have been a vague concept for me." And I thought about it and I couldn't relate more, honestly, because missing boundaries are a huge element in why many people isolate themselves. And for most of us, this misery already started in childhood. We might have been taught directly or indirectly that having boundaries wasn't allowed somehow. So maybe we have been punished for saying no, or our needs were ignored so often that we stopped believing that they even mattered. Over time, we learn to put everyone else first, leaving our own sense of self widely open and unprotected. And this is what's happening here, because without boundaries, we often feel overly sensitive. We're like really thin-skinned or even permeable, like everything, every stimuli from the outside directly reaches our deepest core, and we have no sense of protection here. Every intense emotion, every demand, criticism from others, they directly seep straight through to us, leaving us overwhelmed and absolutely exhausted and drained here. But the good news is that this is something we can actually change. Learning to set boundaries is not actually an easy task for many people who isolate themselves. And this is because it feels so unnatural at first, especially if we grew up believing that it was selfish or wrong to do that. It truly doesn't feel familiar then to us. But setting boundaries isn't about pushing people away, and this is what we have to learn here. It's about protecting our energy and creating space for healthy relationships. It's about saying, this is where I end, and this is where you begin. And this is not selfish, it's necessary. And when we start to practice setting boundaries here, then we slowly, step by step, build a stronger sense of self. This is what I'm also doing right now after my third therapy, that I'm trying to regain this sense of self and slowly building it while actually practicing setting boundaries, communicating my needs, and expressing my emotions. And what happens here, or at least for me at this point, over time, I stopped feeling so exposed, and I now start to begin to find peace and stability that I wanted for so long, even when I'm not alone, which is a completely new experience to me. And by the way, I share all that. I share my journey and how you can also learn to better protect yourself by setting healthy boundaries, by expressing your needs and communicating your emotions as well. And I put that also in courses on our premium platform. So if you want to join our community as well to learn all that and to have a supportive environment from other people who are also affected by neurodivergent conditions or complex trauma, just go to understandable.net/join, get access to all the courses and the community, understandable.net/join. I just released a new course in class number 4 where we talk you through setting boundaries and how that actually works. Now, reason number 6 why we isolate: we feel chronically dysregulated and hypervigilant. For many of us, isolation is a way to cope with the sensation of constantly feeling on the edge. Because when you have been through complex trauma, your nervous system then gets stuck in overdrive. And symptoms of that are, for example, emotional dysregulation and hypervigilance here. What's happening here, I explained that before, you're always scanning for dangers around, even when there is nothing to be afraid of. And this is what also polyvagal theory, for example, describes. We are constantly trapped in a flight or fight state where our body cannot fully relax and feel safe. Here is a visualization of how the 3 states of the central nervous system could look like according to polyvagal theory. There are also other models of how the central nervous system could work. So this is a simplification of how the different states could look like. When you are completely relaxed, when you are grounded, full of compassion, connected with yourself and others, then you are usually in the so-called ventral vagal state. This is our calm state. There is no traumatic reaction here. The reactions we face, like dysregulation and those kind of things, are based on the state of flight or fight that we experience when we detect potential danger. So the flight state is when we feel panic, anxiety, and we want to run away. The fight state is when we feel anger, irritation, or rage, and we feel that we need to fight. And then there's also the dorsal vagal freeze state. This is when we experience dissociation, when we freeze, when we feel at the mercy of others and we can't really move. I also made a full episode about the polyvagal theory, which I will link to you up here in the description below. So if you want to dive more into that, watch this episode. Now, living in this hypervigilant state is pretty exhausting, which makes sense because every noise, every glance, every shift in someone's tone can actually feel like a threat then. One person described this sensation here in the comments, and they said, "I'm always bracing myself, even if I don't know what I'm bracing myself for. It's like I can't turn off the alarm in my head." And I have that as well. When I sometimes, for example, try to fall asleep with another person in the room, my head won't stop spinning and my body won't just relax because it is constantly scanning for danger, because I'm out of control when I fall asleep. So my body never really relaxes entirely when I'm not alone. Over time, this constant tension can also lead to physical symptoms like headaches, like stomach issues, muscle pain, like chronic fatigue. And the thing is here that dysregulation then is not just an emotional thing anymore, it's a somatic thing. And this is actually interesting because it makes so much sense. Dysregulation is not just something that's happening within our minds. It's a neurological and physical reaction. I explain emotional dysregulation also in detail in this episode, which I will link to you also below. It's really fascinating to understand the link between our brain or our neurological level and how emotional dysregulation actually feels. And now we talk about reason number 7 why we isolate. We are introverts. Now, isolation and avoidance aren't necessarily a coping mechanism, because for some of us it also feels natural because we're just introverts at heart, which is such a nice thing. And introversion, that doesn't mean that we don't enjoy people. But it does mean that we need time, that we need isolation to recharge ourselves and to feel like ourselves again. And this tendency is also often amplified by complex trauma symptoms, such as emotional dysregulation, but it's not the cause of it. Social interaction can feel overwhelming because we are managing not only our own emotions, but also the unspoken expectations and moods of everyone around us. And this is why so many of us just feel the need to shut the door and be alone after a long day of interacting with other people. And that quiet time isn't a luxury, it's a necessity, especially for us introverts. On the other hand, introversion isn't just a bad thing. I want to be clear about that, because the beauty of introversion is that it allows us to connect with ourselves on a deeper level. But it's important to remember that it doesn't mean that we have to avoid connection altogether. Balancing alone time with meaningful relationships, ones where we actually feel safe and accepted, that can bring us peace and recharge that we truly need. Reason number 8, we are highly sensitive. As a highly sensitive person, we process the world more deeply than others. That means that we notice subtleties like shifts in tone and energy, but it also means that we can feel overwhelmed by loud noises, bright lights, or chaotic environments. And being highly sensitive also goes beyond just being an introvert. Our heightened sensitivity, it can make social interactions especially exhausting. Under a video about high sensitivity, an HSP described her perception like this: "It's like that I feel everything at once. All the people's emotions, the vibe of the room, and by the end of the day, I'm completely drained." When we are highly sensitive and sometimes over-aroused, it's not that we don't want connection with others, because highly sensitive people often love connecting with others. And this is why they often are so overwhelmed, because they have this strong need and then get into connection. It's more the effort of managing so much additional sensory and emotional input that can leave us needing to retreat here. And this is also, again, closely tied to dysregulation and trauma survivors, because if we're already managing heightened emotions from past wound, then being around others can amplify this overwhelm. Taking time to recharge ourselves as highly sensitive people allows us to function better and feel more grounded. And while it can feel like a burden at times, our sensitivity is also a strength because it allows us to connect deeply with others. It helps us to notice what other people are missing, and it also brings a lot of empathy into our relationships. When you are close with someone who is a highly sensitive person, keep in mind to give them some space from time to time. Now, reason number 9 why we isolate: we are neurodivergent. That means having autism, ADHD, or similar conditions. Well, for some of us, our need to isolate is actually tied to our neurodiversity. Conditions such as autism, ADHD, or other neurodivergent traits, they often mean that we experience the world differently, for some of us more intensely than others. Social interactions, sensory overload, or managing expectations can then feel like too much and leading us to retreat to a space where we feel actually safe. For example, if we are autistic, then navigating social cues and unpredictable situations can be, for some of them, extra exhausting. Someone said, for example, "I can't deal with all the loud noises and the small talk. I just want to stay home where I don't have to mask who I am." Sounds familiar? Similarly, with ADHD, overstimulation can feel like chaos sometimes, where everything demands our attention at once, leaving us mentally drained here. This also ties closely to sensory overload, where crowded environments and loud noises, for example, or even emotional interactions with other human beings can feel overwhelming. And for some, this constant input makes it hard to focus or to feel calm if they have ADHD, which makes them pushing towards isolation just as a way to reset and finally ground the nervous system again. So neurodivergent people have to be extra careful in order to protect their capacity. And finding good balance here is definitely essential to feeling grounded and functioning at our best. And remember, it's not about avoiding others again, it's about creating the conditions our brain diversities requires to thrive as neurodivergent people. And reason number 10, we are depressed. I've read a comment saying depression equals a deep need for rest. And this person totally nailed it in my opinion. Depression, which is, by the way, simply explained, it's something that appears when we repress parts of our personality, like emotions or needs, for a really long time. And depression is therefore a symptom of inauthentic living and comes up when we experience states of severe overwhelm, grief, or other unfavorable emotions that we can't handle well. It's also tied to chronic stress, of course, which is also something that we experience when we repress certain emotions or needs. And for many of us, isolation is deeply tied to these states of depression. In these moments, the world can feel heavy and overwhelming. And even getting out of bed or responding to a text can then feel like too much. And isolation then can feel like a way to cope and to help. It's like a quiet retreat from the energy that it takes to engage with life here. Depression also often makes us disconnected, like we don't belong or like others don't understand us. And there are also complex trauma symptoms like the cycle of toxic shame which are tied to that. If we grew up feeling unworthy or unlovable, depression can amplify those beliefs, convincing us that withdrawing is a safer choice here. I explained the full connection between depression and the toxic shame cycle already in this episode here, which I will link to you below as well. If you're in such a state right now, remember that isolation might feel like a relief in the moment, but it often also feeds the cycle. The key here is to make small, manageable steps, whether it's reaching out to a safe friend, but also seeking professional support in the long term, or simply letting yourself rest without any judgment can be truly helpful. Depression makes connection hard, but breaking the isolation little by little can definitely open the door wildly for healing. Now, after hearing these 10 reasons, I'm sure you will have a deeper understanding of why we isolate and that it's actually totally fine to do that sometimes. And if you're now looking for a bit of interaction and an understanding environment, definitely our community can be a great option for you. We offer a digital safe space and a supportive environment for people who deal with things such as isolation, emotional dysregulation, dissociation, and other trauma-related symptoms. You can access our full platform, including all the online courses on how to set boundaries, how to communicate needs and express your emotions at understandable.net/join. So if you want to join as a member today, go to understandable.net/join and we see each other in the community. Well, some final thoughts from my side here. In the end, what came to my mind quite often is that healing, what we all want, it doesn't mean avoiding everything that could potentially harm us. And this is really important here because we tend to avoid everything and everyone, to completely isolate us in order to make us cope as a survival mechanism. And in many situations, this is actually helpful and true. But healing also means going out into the world and growing so that we can handle other people and the other world around us in a better way. It's not that other people and the world become less potentially dangerous if we do that, but it's us who become stronger in handling all this. We learn to protect ourselves better. We set our boundaries. We feel that we are worthy and good the way we are. This is what we actually should learn. And sometimes I think a bit less avoidance is better to expand our comfort zone. In order to grow and to handle all this better, we have to do that from time to time. So open up, let people in if your intuition says that it's safe to do that. What do you think about the topic? Are you an isolator, or are you actually working on breaking this cycle? Do you want connection, or are you happy to be alone and maybe an introvert? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to support this podcast, share the episodes with some other people, rate the show 5 stars at Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And I see and speak to you next Sunday for another episode here on the channel. Have a great day.